as Elisa said, I'm actually a graduate of QT at engineering, and one of the things you realise when you start to think about engineering is that engineers are basically just concerned with building, breaking, hopefully fixing stuff. And it's interesting, I wrote a book a few years ago which was really looking at resources and the way we as society uses resources. And I came to a very interesting insight in that book that I want to share with you today. And that insight is that, ladies and gentlemen, we don't actually live in one world. If you want to understand the stuff around us, the first thing we have to recognise is that we actually live in two worlds. That's right, you may think you're just sitting there at the moment, you're living in one world, you're actually living in two worlds. Two very different worlds. Let's start with the first world. This is the first world. I'm going to call this the Biosphere. This is the world of us as biological entities, clever monkeys running around doing all those things that we do in the biosphere, eating food, drinking water, dealing with the byproduct of eating food and drinking water, stuff that comes out the other end, making other clever little monkeys. That is us as biological entities, right? It's a world that we're very comfortable when we evolved into this world. It's actually the thing that we understand, actually, very implicitly. But ladies and gentlemen, there's actually a whole second world. A very second world. It's actually I'm going to call it the Technosphere. It's a world that only appeared about 7,000 years ago. Right? It's when the clever monkeys started to find that they could get a stick and they could sharpen the stick, and then they could make the stick out of bronze, and then they could make the stick out of steel, and they could stick microprocessors in the stick, and the stick becomes an iPhone. Right? That is the world of the Technosphere. Right? And the interesting thing is, when you really strip it about, everything that we think about is actually part of one of those two worlds, and they're quite separate. The world of the Biosphere is actually the world of things we consume. Right? The world of the Technosphere, we don't actually often consume it. It's just something in the world we use. So that bottle there, right? The stuff in that bottle, sir, the water is in the Biosphere, the bottle is in the Technosphere. Right? And it's only when we start to dig into that we actually start to understand the world around us. So what I want to do, I'm going to start with the Biosphere. The Biosphere is great. Right? I love the Biosphere. I love my glass of wine, I love my good meal, I love all the other stuff you do in the Biosphere. But interestingly, and even though we're reasonably wasteful in the Biosphere, and here's an interesting example of we're around about 40% efficient in the Biosphere in terms of our use of food. So that means that we lose 40% of the food in the Biosphere. So we're around 50% efficient. 40% of the stuff that we grow in a paddock never makes it to someone's mouth. Right? That's how we perform in the Biosphere as biological entities. Now that's pretty poor, you might say. That's all lost because of production processes, transit. A lot of it's because we buy too much and just throw it away. This is a statistic from the Australian populace. Every family on average throws away about $1,000 worth of food a year. That's about $20 a week of food that we're perfectly good food we're throwing away. But that's us in the Biosphere. But even though we're wasteful, our impact is actually not that great. Did you know that the biomass of humans is only 1/10 the biomass of ants? Right? In other words, the number of calories that we as humans, even if you add all that extra loss that the stuff we're planting and then maybe losing it, is actually only a fraction of the calories consumed by ants. Ant brethren that will one day be our ant overlords, I'm sure. But interestingly, that's the Biosphere, right? It's the other side, it's the second half. It's this funny thing called the Technosphere is actually where a lot of the impact occurs. And it's also the place where there's a lot of waste. Now take the car. Right? The car is a wonderful Technosphere invention, right? It's actually improved, it's allowed us to connect our cities, it's allowed us to have friends in different places, it can sometimes get people to work, it's improved our efficiency, it does all these sorts of things. The internal combustion engine, awesome Technosphere invention. But guess how efficient that Technosphere invention is? 1.5%. So if you take the amount of energy that goes into the internal combustion engine, so the petrol going in, around only 15% of that is actually converted into mobility, right? So 85% of that energy, hang in there, I am a nerd, I like numbers, 85% of that stuff gets turned into heat and noise, only 15% of it turns into mobility. But of that 15%, right, most of that's actually moving the car, not the person. Right? 90% of that 15, or 9/10 of that 15% is moving a person. That leaves you 1.5%. That's moving the car. That leaves you 1.5% to move the person. A car is only 1.5% efficient. And believe it or not, that's actually the story for a lot of the stuff that exists in the technosphere. Even that car itself, right? Most cars are only used for 5% of their time. 1 hour a day is the average use of a car. That's 95% of that asset is actually sitting there unused. So a thing that's only 1.5% efficient in the first place. You look at the capital, sort of translation of the capital into actual mobility, it's very, very poor. There's also some stuff that's very interesting that actually exists in both. Water is a fascinating thing. Think about the water that comes into your house, right? It's actually got two sets of uses. There's some biosphere uses, which is drinking the water, and there's some technosphere uses, which is, clean children, clean me, clean clothes. What do you think the balance between those two is? Well, the average family only consumes 2% of the water. So 2% of the water that comes into a house is biosphere. 98% of the water that comes into a house is actually about the technosphere. Right? And clean children is pretty good, I must admit. Right? I've got 2 of them, and they definitely need a lot of cleaning. But you can start to see there's a really interesting balance. It's not 50-50, right? But curiously enough, we purify that water, that 100%, all the water, to the 2% standard, right? Whereas actually to get the clean children, you probably don't need them. That's a lot of energy, that's a lot of resources, that's a lot of things going into keeping that water very, very pure. And I guess so the interesting thing is, and the other thing that we've been doing, which I guess is starting to come into some thoughts around sustainability, where we want to go in the future and how we can use resources actually better, is that we often treat stuff in the technosphere as if it was just in the biosphere, right? Because that's our traditional, we think of things as consumable. That bottle, when it at its end of life, yeah, sure, it might get recycled a bit like stuff in the biosphere can sometimes, luckily, as biological entities, we never do one-way chemical reactions, so really good, right? Everything with just a bit more energy can be converted back into something useful, right? As in the technosphere, often there is a lot of one-way chemical reactions going on. There's a lot of stuff, and we're treating stuff in that the technosphere is bleeding in as if it was actually part of the biosphere and starting to come into the biosphere. And so I guess for me, starting to think about this and breaking it down, because yes, not only am I a nerd, but I'm also a systems engineer, which makes me like a systems engineering nerd, which is terrible, but means you want to break everything down. And I was very fortunate once. I was in a very boring meeting, which gave me the creative space to think about things. And I actually started to really dig into this concept of what exists in the technosphere, right? Because when you really start to say every single thing in this room, take the biosphere aside, so the stuff that we're consuming, every single thing in this room starts to fit into one of 5 categories, right? They're either at the very top here, we've got things that are single use, so it's like the plastic bottle. There's things that are multiple use, like my jacket here, right? I'm wearing it slowly degrading, right? But I'm getting multiple uses out of it. There's tools. So that video camera back there could be classified as a tool. Ideally, it'll just keep working. We just need the thing that it's doing. There's trinkets, which actually might have no actual use except for amenity value looking at it, but those things probably never degrade, right? Antiques or whatever it might be. And interesting, there's a 5th category, and I brought this in here because it's not quite a thing, but it's actually how we use the thing. It's a concept, service. So the light, for example, coming from the light bulb, which is the tool, is actually the service. And if you look at this room, every single thing that you can possibly imagine fits into one of those categories. And the interesting thing is, though, the higher up on that thing of single use down to service, the more impact, the more environmental impact, the more resource involved in actually giving you something, giving you what you want in the technosphere. And if you start to think about what's happening around the products around us, what's going around us stuff, especially as we start to see services and start to see resources become more expensive for others, is actually things starting to find their way further down there. So for example, you take the green bag. The green bag is actually just an example of a single-use item, the plastic disposable bag turning into a multiple-use item. Now, it is only a multiple-use item. Anybody who's, like me, has got a couple of really manky green bags in their cupboard, right, realises that it is still only a multiple-use item. But at least we're actually seeing it moving in that space. Another one's interesting, the keep cup. Right, that's much more of like a single-use item, the disposable coffee cup turning into a tool. Right? I don't know if you've ever seen those things. They're totally indestructible. Right? But that's great because it's actually turning a single-use item into a tool, right? And theoretically, you could have those forever. Another one that's really interesting, and this is why I added, is we're actually also seeing things like tools starting to find their way into things like services. So a printer, the university, I'm sure, and in fact most large businesses, once upon a time they owned printers and copiers. These days they lease printers and copiers. They don't actually want the printer. They just want, the copied piece of paper. And really seeing how these things move down that train is the thing that actually starts to unlock pathways, unlock opportunities for us to understand how to use things in the technosphere better, understand actually how to become more resource efficient, understanding opportunities, future opportunities and business models. And I'm going to focus on three in particular that seem to be really taking off at the moment. The first one is really interesting, as you can probably see. It's about moving things from either single-use items to multiple-use, or indeed, if they're already multiple-use items, making them so we can use them more times. Right? And this is what I'm doing, actually. This is what I decided to dedicate the next 10 years of my life to with a company called TuShare, is basically we identified, I've got 2 young kids, right? A 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, right? You pretty quickly get to realize how much stuff how much stuff in the technosphere, not just the biosphere, ladies and gentlemen, how much stuff in the technosphere you need. I mean, the biosphere is pretty amazing. Lots of stuff there. But in the technosphere, you also need a lot of stuff to raise the children, whether it's toys or clothes, and they grow out of it very quickly. And so I started to really do some research into how much stuff do we effectively grow out of. And it turns out that, well, how much stuff do we not see the full lifespan of under the first owner? It turns out there's 4 reasons why we have things, and these are effectively the reasons why we have stuff on our shelf that we're never going to use again. Right? And it's because of one of 4 things. They're either life stage items like kids' clothes, or you change weight, or you've changed the size of your house, whatever your life stage changes. They're media, like books, like you've read that book, it's great, but hey, I'm sort of over Jeffrey Archer these days, or whatever it might be, right? You've read the book and you don't need to consume it, so it's media because the actual service was the story, not the book. They're upgradables like mobile phones or sporting equipment or kitchenware, right? Where you want the new one and the old one's still good. And there's fashion, which is where the thing was just made really, really well, which is great, but my taste has changed and I don't want to wear it anymore. And interestingly, we did a study and we found that there's over 100 billion things that are sold every year. Can you believe it? 100 billion things that get sold every year that fit into one of those 4 categories: life stage items, media, upgradables, or fashion. That are pretty much, because of the very nature of the item, not going to see their full lifespan under the first owner. So the idea behind TuShare was, let's make it really easy for people to give stuff to each other, because giving is the easiest way of transferring it, and then we built a whole logistics system behind it, so we can now ship anything up to 10 kilograms in the same capital city for $10, right? So that people are actually sharing and just giving stuff away for free. So that's reuse, right? But there's a whole other set of interesting products, which is, actually the things like the tools already, the stuff that, that potentially you don't necessarily even need to, I'll give you an example. Say a washing machine. I'm going to pick on you, sorry. I sell you a washing machine, right? That's a very good Technosphere invention. It gives you clean clothes. I sell you this washing machine. How long do you want that washing machine to last for? A long time. How long do I, as the company selling the washing machine, want that washing machine to last for? I'd say the warranty period plus a few days, right? That's ideal, right? So interesting, there's a misaligned incentive there, right? Now let's turn it around. I give you a washing machine and I charge you 10 cents a wash or whatever the economics work out there. How long do we want it to last for? We both want it to last for as long as possible because we're both getting the most out of the asset. And suddenly you're buying not the washing machine, you're actually buying the service of clean clothes. And eventually I might work out, hey, I can bundle the detergent in there and charge you an extra cent. And then I might say, hey, I can do clean clothes without any detergent at all and still get the extra cent. Or I can, bundle the water. I can monitor it to see if the asset is surviving. Right? And I can ring you up and say, hey, you're not really balancing your washing machine very well. Right? All these things that it promotes the longevity of it. So that shift from products and us thinking about I want the product to actually I just need the service is what's happening around GoGet. I think that GoGet's up here in Queensland. For example, they don't sell cars, they sell mobility, the service. Right? There's a whole lot of companies realizing that people don't want light, they don't want energy. Right? Who wants a kilojoule of energy? I can't even hold a kilojoule of energy. I want light, heat, and mobility. How do I sell those things as services? Wokinghire Council, you can sign a contract and basically for 25, for a certain amount of money, you can get your house at 25 degrees the whole year round. And then they come in and they insulate and they check under the doors and do all that sort of stuff because they're just providing the service of heat. So focusing on reuse, shifting to services, and the final one, which I guess is very interesting, the Technosphere we're also going to see, and you can see they're all starting to bleed into each other, is this notion of sharing idle assets. That I talked about the inefficiency of a car sitting there, 23 out of 24 hours at a time, right? That's happening with a whole lot of products. Like a drill. A drill is used around about 20 minutes of its life. And in fact, we don't want drills. Who wants a drill? I want a hole, right? That's the thing you want. And so there's all these different ways we're trying to find ways to unlock sharing of assets, sharing particularly of tools, because you can share multiple use items at the end of their lifespan. You can actually share tools, at the end of the use of the first one, you can share tools at any time, right? And how can we actually, there's a whole thing called the sharing economy, which subject to other TED Talks, which is basically about untapping those idle assets using very, very local marketplaces for people and infrastructure to allow that to share. So, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully I've given you an interesting insight into, basically maybe a different way of looking at all the things around you. And when you go home tonight, maybe you could sit down and think, what is going on in the biosphere? How am I behaving in the Technosphere? What am I doing? And so basically for those who are interested in, living sustainably or indeed saving money or whatever it might be, the interesting thing does become in the biosphere, it's all about recycling, right? It's all about capturing the products and yes, being more efficient. But in the Technosphere, it's a very different story. It's actually about these very interesting ways, focusing on reuse. How do we make reuse easier? How do we shift from products to services? How do I go from ownership to access? How do I actually just understand what it is that I need from those services? And also, how can I share assets more effectively? Thank you.